So what we're going to do is listen to all of our presenters speak, and then there'll be some time for discussion and questions at the end of the session for everybody together. If you do have questions during the presentations, then I would encourage you to use the chat function to put these questions down. My colleague Aparna will be monitoring this and collating them so we can bring out some of the themes for the discussion at the end of the session. So please do use the chat function to send us your thoughts, ideas, and any areas you want clarification or further discussion on. So without further ado, it would be great to get started with our first presentation today. I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Eva Ziedan. Eva is a cultural heritage and community development practitioner with more than 10 years of field experience in the Middle East and Europe. Today, she's going to be presenting a paper entitled Rethinking Living Heritage, Syria as a Case Study. And the presentation today is going to focus largely on communities in the Al-Ghab Plain, but this is part of a wider body of Dr. Ziedan's research, particularly a project called Souls of Homes, Heritage as Manifestation of Community Relationships Through Space and Time, which was recently published in Routledge's Urban Recovery, Intersecting Displacement with Post-War Reconstruction. That being said, I would love to welcome Eva and ask her to share her presentation with us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm very glad to be with you today and participate in this important conference. I will be sharing my presentation. Is it fine?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my presentation's title is Rethinking Living Heritage in Syria as a Case Study. And by living heritage, I intend the dynamic concept manifested by values and practices, and how is being readapted to develop concrete socio-economic benefit, ensuring the continuity of a human interaction at time of extreme violence. My direct observation and interaction with those active in local community in Syria before and during the conflict allowed me to see this paradigm. During the conflict, people lose the basic elements of living with the absence of a state institution that usually carry out services. Under the fragile security and economic situation, local communities will try to fill the vacuum resulting from the absence of state services. Here, people find themselves encouraged to use all their social energy and solidarity to activate their community resources and the sedimented legacy-based knowledge. This is to find solutions to problems that directly threaten their life. The viable solution will then be collectively owned and used under collective responsibility. So I'm talking about values and practices. I'm talking about living heritage and how, and his ability to adapt and develop itself. And I will explain now this paradigm through one case study in Al-Ghab Plain area. The Al-Ghab Plain depression is located in the fertile depression located in the middle Orontes basin in the northern Hama governorate in Syria, as we can see it here. Archaeological studies have shown that for many thousands of years, the area of the Orontes basin have been subject to intensive agricultural activity and also operation related to water management. Many sites flourished near the river, such as Hama, Homs, Ressan, El Nabi Mendu, Apamea. And during the Roman and Byzantine period, the area between Apamea and Restan, here, between Apamea, Restan, and Salaminia in particular, had intensive and varied water supply system, such as irrigational channels, canals, and waterways, norias. Some of these ancient irrigation facilities have been rehabilitated and reused. Others have been discontinued, as the waterways, for example. Modern irrigation devices have emerged, like pumps, Till now, water and its management have been a central issue for the community living in this area that mainly relied on an income generated by seasonal harvest, through which the Orontes Basin before the conflict generated about 25% of the total agriculture production in Syria. The town and villages in the Anla Plain area are historically characterized like a complex communal mixture of people living in this territory. For centuries, the inhabitants have been sharing the same socioeconomic environment. However, as in many cases in other in Syria, deep-set roots have fueled ongoing conflict, such as the economic factor. In fact, in 2010, most agricultural workers and their families suffered from poverty. The percentage of poverty in agricultural sector was 72%. The conflict in Syria impacted the area further. Starting from the autumn 2012, the region was divided between the control of the Syrian central government here in the south and the opposition-held area. It's in the north here. About 1.6 million people from Orontes Basin have been displaced and have found refuge in Syria or in neighboring countries. The conflict border cut the irrigation channels, causing its drought due to the fuel and electricity to power the water. Even if it was known that these channels are the vital nerves that connect these areas and keep them alive. In 2017, voluntary groups were able to locally negotiate and communicate by discussing to resolve issues with all the parties in conflict for many civil issues such as kidnapped people, electricity, or robbery at checkpoints. These informal groups were composed in both opposition and government-held area, some who were able to move between those areas. They were trusted by their respective community and their colleagues at the local administration institution. They were able to obtain permits from the local authorities to clean some of irrigational channel in the contested area, maintain the water pump in action, and clean landfills across the line between the government and the opposition-held area. One interest in cleaning of this channel was the need to maintain and restore them so that irrigation water may be available served and to serve citizens in both areas who rely on agriculture. The allowed time allowed me to present this case study, but we can find it entwined in the traditional houses of Aleppo and Damascus, as the ancient folk chant of people in the steppe in the year of droughts. Likewise, drawing on wisdom and the ability to keep communicating and overcome obstacles such as checkpoint to devising and creative solution. In fact, living heritage is about answering the need of local and to protect the interaction of the people to which it's belong. Why rethinking? Because here I'm not talking about intangible or intangible aspect of heritage that we can classify it. It should be classified and have clear boundaries in order to be put in heritage list. I'm talking about the negotiation and renegotiation of people to make connection, rework values, work together to solve problem, make decision, and how and when they take leadership. I think we need to rethink our tools to support this aspect as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. That was really, really fascinating and inspiring work. I think particularly this question that comes out of this for me about the opportunities and the risks of understanding things like irrigation as heritage, what that might do in conflict time, I think is something that maybe we can explore a little in the discussion later. But really, really fascinating work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Tianyue from Tsinghua University, and she will be presenting on climate-related natural disasters and the outbreak of civil conflict. Tianyue is a student from the Department of International Relations at Tsinghua University, whose research interests focus on climate change, conflict, and gender. So I'd love to pass the floor to Tianyue, please. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Glad to present my research. Now, can you see my screen? Okay. Okay, my research topic is climate-related natural hazards and the outbreak of civil conflict. In IPCC's fourth assessment report, it is estimated that warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and that climate change could become a major factor for the outbreak of conflict. Climate change will directly affect cultural heritage as well as indirectly impacts through human activities and triggering conflicts. As UNESCO Director General Irina Bokova said on the public briefing on the United Nations Security Council, the deliberate destruction of heritage is a war crime. It has become a tactic of war to tear societies over the long term in a strategy of cultural cleansing. This is why defending cultural heritage is more than a cultural issue. It is a security imperative inseparable from that of defending human life. However, there are relatively few studies on the impact of climate change on conflict outbreak using large N-scale panel data sets. In this research, I use the cross-national time series panel data and logic model to examine how cultural-related natural hazards, including floods, droughts, storms, and extreme temperatures, affect internal armed conflicts. So, what's the impact of natural hazards on the outbreak of internal conflicts? Currently, there are mainly three research approaches. The first approach focuses on direct paths, which argues natural hazards may increase the possibility of conflict through psychological factors and resource scarcity. Natural hazards can cause massive loss of life and property, leading to anger and frustration among victims and increasing dissatisfaction with governments, which lack the ability or willingness to mitigate the negative effects of disasters. The second approach assumes natural hazards will impede economic growth and lead to large amount of displaced people, increasing the possibility of internal conflict on site. The third approach argues contextual factors will mitigate the impacts of natural hazards on the onset of internal armed conflict. For example, countries with lower levels of economic development, higher rates of poverty, and higher dependence on agriculture may be more vulnerable to economic shocks caused by natural hazards, thus more likely to experience conflicts. Therefore, my research has four hypotheses. The first one is the occurrence of natural hazards will increase the possibility of civil conflicts on sites. Hypothesis 2 is countries with lower levels of economic development are more likely to experience civil conflicts on sites. Hypothesis 3 is countries with higher dependence on agriculture for livelihoods are more likely to experience civil conflicts on sites. Hypothesis 4 is countries with higher government revenues are less likely to experience civil conflicts on sites. This is the research design data and methods. I choose natural hazards as my independent variable because I particularly focus on the impacts of climate change, so I include the climate-related natural hazards. I choose domestic armed conflicts as the dependent variable, and I choose GDP per capita proportion of mountainous area as the control variable. I choose GDP per capita proportion of agriculture, proportion of government revenues as the moderating variables. These variables are taken from the World Bank. This is the models of my research. The first one measures the impact of climate-related natural hazards, and the second measures the moderating effects. This is the descriptive statistics of my variables of interest. And this is the regression results. We can see from the graph that the coefficient of climate-related natural hazards is statistically significant means that the occurrence of climate-related natural hazards will increase the possibility of civil conflicts on sites. And this is the model for moderating effects. We can see from the graph that we can see from that the coefficients are also statistically significant, means that countries with lower levels of economic development, higher dependence on agriculture, and lower government revenues will have a higher possibility to experience civil conflict on sites. This is my model diagnosis and evaluation. We can see from this graph that the marginal effects are on the right of the dashed line, means that the marginal effects for my research is valid. So in conclusion, climate change will increase the magnitude and frequency of natural hazards, thus increasing the possibility of civil conflict on sites. Countries with lower levels of economic development, higher dependence on agriculture, and lower government revenues are more likely to experience civil conflict on sites. This is my research. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tianyue. That was an admirably concise presentation. So we have a couple of minutes left before moving to the next speaker. I just wondered if I could ask you a quick follow-up question on your presentation before we move on, which was, you did, I think, a great job of setting out your research on the links between climate and civil conflict. But I wondered, particularly given the broader theme of this panel, where you see the question of heritage coming into that. I think Aparna, who is helping to moderate this, always talks about heritage as the missing link. And I wondered if you had any reflections from your research on what the role of heritage might be in either promoting or mitigating the conflicts that you've been looking at.
Oh yes, I think it's one of the shortcomings of my research. I haven't had time to cover culture into my research. So I think it's one of the points I want to work on in the future.
And do you have a sense of how you might build that into your model, into your research?
I think I will focus on how climate change and conflicts will affect the cultural heritage, because of course they will destroy some cultural heritage, and I want to focus on this point.
Thanks. Aparna, I can see you've got a quick question.
Yeah, no, I was actually very, it's a really interesting presentation that you have given, and also the variables that you have shown. And one thing that really interested me, and it's just a niggle of an idea, but this is to spark discussion. And I think hidden in your variables is that dependence on agriculture. And since agriculture is closely related to human-earth interactions, and in this conference, the premise of this conference is that how human beings have been interacting with the culture is also lived experiences, and also what we gather from these interactions and how we have been. It's about life ways. So agriculture, which is so culture in this way is not something which is external, but very much internal in that sense. I guess it's not. So I think there are glimpses there, but it needs to be unpacked. The connections are there. So I just think maybe later in our discussion, Elly, we should try to unpack this. So thank you for your great presentation.
Thank you for your remarks.
So moving on to our next distinguished presenter, I'd like to welcome Cornelius Holtorf, who is going to be presenting on the risks for peace due to the promotion of heritage. Cornelius is currently a professor of archaeology and a holder of a UNESCO chair on heritage futures at Linnaeus University in Sweden. He's also the director of the graduate school in contract archaeology at the same university. Recently, Cornelius has published a number of co-written books and edited volumes, including Heritage Futures with Rodney Harrison a book that I enjoyed very much, I have to say, and a co-edited volume entitled Cultural Heritage and the Future. So I would love to welcome Cornelius and ask him to share his research and his thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here. So what I would like to do in the next 8 minutes is to promote our joint course to give culture and cultural heritage more room on the global, in the various global issues we're working on in relation to climate change, for example, and sustainability and so on, by taking a broader view and indeed encouraging a critical discussion about some of the issues that we often maybe take for granted. So I hope we can have more of a critical discussion on these issues in the future. Now, as you heard, I'm representing here our UNESCO chair on Heritage Futures, and you may wonder what Heritage Futures is. Our definition is like this: it is about the roles of heritage in managing the relations between present and future societies. So it's not about predicting what will happen, but it's about really managing a relation that has a very strong aspect in the present. And that's also the context in which I see this conference and my contribution to it. This is a picture of some of us a year ago. Our vision is to build a global capacity for futures thinking among heritage professionals, and that is another aspect within which I'm offering my thoughts here today. So the thesis I want to present here today is that culture and heritage are not necessarily always assets in regards to the mitigation or indeed adaptation related to the climate crisis. It is rather that sometimes culture and cultural heritage may indeed prevent necessary transformations and even fuel future conflicts and divisions. So it's not always it's not always productive in the sense of our intentions to promote an uncritical view of culture and heritage. And I think we should look at some of the problems with that. I'm not the first one pointing this out, but I think on much of our discussions that doesn't, it's very celebratory, and there is not a lot of attention being given to critical assessments of these issues. Now I want to phrase these ideas under the theme here, which I call the heritage climate paradox, because I think there is a deeply unfortunate contradiction between heritage and the intentions we have in relation to addressing the climate crisis. Now, this is twofold, this paradox. One is that heritage is at the heart about conservation and preserving something that we value. It is not about transformation primarily. And yet, in the climate scenario, we live in a world that is being transformed and that needs to transform in order to function in the future. And heritage is not necessarily the best context within which this transformation can be promoted. And the second aspect is that heritage is so much about local and national agendas, and it's not always helpful in finding global solutions. And yet, it is the global solutions that need to be found if we want to address global issues. The climate crisis is an obvious example, but the pandemic right now is another example. And we've seen how the world is struggling with various divisions between world regions and countries, and all sorts of suspicion and prejudices that come out occasionally. So I feel we need it's not always helpful to use the existing cultural heritage paradigm, which is about local identities, national identities, cultural and ethnic perspectives that are not global, but something smaller. So let me develop that a little bit. Heritage at heart is something that we have inherited from the past, obviously. It's something that we value today and that we wish to transmit to the future. And that's why I say it has a sort of very strong timeless perception to it. It's not something that we want to change. It's something that we want to keep. So it is essentially about conserving something. Now, the climate crisis on the other side is very much about change, and indeed it's referred to as climate change also. And that means that the climate is changing at the moment. We all experience that already, but it also requires changes from us for the purposes of mitigation, but also adaptation. And in that sense, it involves a transformation of our lives. And I mean, all human lives in the world in different ways, yes, but still we're all affected. And in particular of many people's livelihoods, because heritage is connected to, for example, farming and other subsistence practices that may not be able to be practiced in the future due to changing natural conditions. So that's one aspect. And then here's a second one, that the notion of heritage is very much about cultural distinction, and that's a distinction that is significant in space. So we identify different heritage contexts in terms of cultures and in terms of certain areas, territories to which they belong, and that can in some cases have a dimension of land rights even. Doesn't always have that, but there is usually a very strong spatial dimension to it. And it involves a separation between us and them, or between different groups. There was one group distinct from another group, and that's sort of the dynamics of cultural heritage as we know it today. And yet climate crisis requires something else. It needs us to work together. It needs to have a very strong sense of solidarity, of trust between each other, and we need to find a way by which we can overcome borders and see what we all share and also the common needs we have and how we can help each other. And so you see that this is not necessarily the same compared to what heritage is promoting. Now, here's one example, which is Palmyra. We heard about Syria earlier. And if you look at the image here in a larger size, this is, I think, a fantastic image, which shows the concert which the Russian government organized in Palmyra some years ago, after it had been liberated with the help of the Russian army. And of course, later on, it was taken again by the Islamic State. So this is one example where cultural heritage contributed to fueling a conflict that was partly about territory, who should own this area and who should be dominant in Syria. And there was a time when everybody was afraid that the Islamic State may take over. And it's also a conflict about different ways of life. We shouldn't forget that the Islamic State is also based on a particular form of heritage, not one that necessarily many of us would approve of or want to be part of, but it is heritage. It is a particular tradition that they feel they want to promote with means of war and all sorts of cruelties, obviously. So heritage is very strongly involved in conflicts like that, and it's not always something that contributes to peace, but it can also make it even worse. And in this case, we know that the Islamic State came back and reconquered Palmyra after that, and they did a number of horrible things at this site. And of course, that was not a coincidence, but it was done as a provocation for the international community that had a very different sense of what Palmyra represented. And also, I should say that this is in no way particular to the countries that are involved in this case studies, but this happens in many parts of the world, and there's nothing distinctive here about Syria or Russia. It's just an example that is a very strong visual one. Right, so these are the reasons why I think that heritage may hinder our common global agenda in the world. At least sometimes it may do that. And now, what is our common global agenda? There's a new document which I've put here by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and that's one version of a common agenda, but an interesting one. And if you look at what he argues in that report, then two of the main points are that he wants things we need to, as humanity, we need to address these two challenges. We need to re-embrace global solidarity, and we need to renew the social contract between governments and their people, and also between different societies. So this is both within society and between societies. These are key questions which we all hopefully can agree on, where I think heritage should make a contribution. But the current way in which we define and use heritage is not always useful in that respect, but it may hinder global solidarity and trust between people. And in some cases, it can even risk peace or make conflicts worse and lead to additional bloody conflicts and wars in some cases. And as I said, there are a number of examples for that. So my argument here, and I'm coming to the end, is that we should take the heritage climate paradox seriously and rethink maybe what heritage can do, in some cases does. We should question what cultural heritage does. And I noticed that Laura Jane Smith gave the keynote yesterday, and this is very much based on her thinking, where she's also asking what heritage does in society, because that's the key point at the end of the day. What uses do we hope it will have, and how do we make this happen and facilitate these benefits that we think it can have? Right, so then I think this is the message that I want to leave with you from the perspective of our chair on Heritage Futures, that we think we should be scrutinizing heritage more in the way, or in our ambition to manage the relations between present and future societies. And it's not always part of the answer. It can also require us to rethink a few things that we sometimes take for granted. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Cornelius. That was a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. I know personally this idea of the paradox within heritage is very convincing. I'm currently involved in a research project with colleagues in Mauritania, and we've had a lot of discussions around the kind of the paradoxical role of local Islamic traditions and heritages as both being a source of peace and a potential source of conflict, and the question of how to engage with that in a way that is positive and still authentic to communities is a really live one, and one that my colleagues there are grappling with. So I think it's a fascinating area of work to be pursuing further. I'm sure I've seen as well that we've got a lot of comments there in the chat, so I think we've got some rich discussion to come at the end of the session around this. Next up, I would like to welcome Dr. Nick Brooks, who is presenting a paper developed with Dr. Joanne Clarke, both from the University of East Anglia. So Nick is going to be presenting on culture, conflict and climate vulnerability, adaptation in Western Sahara. Nick is a consultant and researcher whose work focuses on resilience and adaptation to climate change. And he directed the Western Sahara Archaeology Project with Joanne Clarke from 2002 to 2018, addressing heritage issues and evidence of past human occupation in the context of environmental change in the non-self-governing territory of Western Sahara. In 2021, in close cooperation with the Sahrawi and international colleagues, he coordinated the first indicative nationally determined contribution to Western Sahara, launched to coincide with COP26. So I think that's really apposite presentation for our day today. So without further ado, Nick, I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elly. So I'm going to talk about the intersection of climate, conflict and culture in Western Sahara. And as Elly's already said, this presentation draws on the first Sahrawi indicative nationally determined contribution, or NDC, essentially a national climate change plan, which was developed, and this is very important for me to say, by a joint Sahrawi and international team, including myself and Joe Clarke, who's in the audience today, to coincide with COP26. So this represents the work of a considerable number of people, and I'm just presenting on their behalf. So Western Sahara is defined by the United Nations as a non-self-governing territory, which means it's a territory in which the decolonization process is not yet complete. Most of Western Sahara is occupied by Morocco, but about a fifth of the territory is controlled by the Frente Polisario, the Sahrawi National Liberation Movement, which established the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, the SADR, in 1976. And the SADR has been recognized by a number of countries and is a member of the African Union. Now, as we see on this map here, the Polisario and Moroccan controlled areas are separated by this thing called the berm, the red line running through the map. And this is a series of fortifications, earthworks, minefields, and so on that runs the entire length of Western Sahara. Now, most Sahrawi live in refugee camps around the town of Tindouf in Algeria, which you can also see on the map here. but a considerable number also live under Moroccan occupation, and a small number also live in the Polisario-controlled areas, which they refer to as the liberated territories, although this population has declined recently due to persistent drought and a resumption of the conflict in November 2020. So what sort of climate change risks and impacts are we seeing here? Well, I think we can say that the Sahrawi and the refugee population in particular is at the front line of climate change. The refugee camps experience periodic devastating flooding, intensifying heat extremes, and growing water scarcity. And all of these hazards are going to get worse as climate change accelerates. And they're also subject to periodic dust storms, although we're not sure about the evolution of these in the future. Now, these hazards are associated with a range of impacts, including the destruction of infrastructure and homes, homelessness, so infrastructure, we're also talking about schools, health clinics, and so on, food insecurity, poor health, and disruption to children's education, and so on. So there's a whole suite of impacts associated with worsening climate hazards and impacts here. So the conflict very directly increases the vulnerability of the Sahrawi to climate change and its impacts. The refugee population has been displaced from areas that are actually quite rich in resources to locations that are resource scarce, and where the impacts of climate change are much worse. And I think this is critical. So these maps on the right show different measures of risk related to heat extremes, and we can see that the coastal areas where most of the Sahrawi refugees originate are actually at lower risk than the interior areas where they've been displaced to. So they've been forced from areas where the impacts of climate change are relatively speaking, small, to areas where the impacts are very, very great. And at the same time, their situation makes them more socially vulnerable. I mean, the camps suffer from, for example, poor infrastructure, chronic food insecurity, and precarious social and economic conditions. And all of these factors, as described in a massive body of academic literature, are associated with increased vulnerability and an inability or reduced ability to cope with the impacts of climate change and climate hazards. Another thing we need to consider is the fact that the Sahrawi Republic, the SADR, is not a UN member state. And this means that it can't participate in climate negotiations, that it's excluded from global climate governance, and that it can't access most climate finance from international mechanisms. So the Sahrawi therefore can't access the resources that are available to most developing countries to help them address the impacts of climate change. And what we're seeing here is the international system, and in particular, the system of climate governance under the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is actually amplifying their vulnerability, constraining their adaptation opportunities, and compounding the injustice of them being a population that has made an absolutely negligible contribution to climate change, but is subject to some of the worst impacts of it. And as we see in the map on the bottom left here, the conflict also has some direct impacts on the environment that increase environmental vulnerability. And in the image here, we see the berm, the diagonal line running across the map, blocking drainage channels and starving the downstream wadis of moisture and making them more vulnerable to drought and desiccation. So now let's get to the main topic of the conference, which is the role of culture. Now, traditionally, the Sahrawi are nomadic pastoralists, practicing mobile camel and goat herding. And pastoralist livelihoods, I think as a lot of us will appreciate, are predicated on resilience and the navigation of climatic variability, uncertainty, and change. And in fact, pastoralism in North Africa emerged in response to a massive global climatic reorganization in the Middle Holocene about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. So its origins are in adaptation to rapid and severe climate change. But the conflict has all but ended mobility and pastoralism in Western Sahara, undermining this reservoir of resilience. And it's forced the Sahrawi to become sedentary as refugees or inhabitants of urban centers in the occupied areas. And it's prevented them from accessing the natural resources on which they've traditionally depended. So consequently, this traditional knowledge relating to natural resources and their management is being lost. And there are a number of studies that have looked at this explicitly. Oops, pardon me. So the conflict is also interacting with climate to undermine livelihoods and threaten Sahrawi culture and, by extension, I think we can say identity to a certain extent. A small number of Sahrawi, I think as I've already mentioned, still practice nomadic pastoralism in the Polisario-controlled areas, but the berm and threats from mines and munitions restricts their access. It restricts their mobility. There are areas they can't go or that are too dangerous to access. And so it reduces their options in terms of mobility and foraging in times of drought. And this has made them more vulnerable to the protracted drought conditions that have persisted since 2017. And so drought and the resumption of hostilities in late 2020 have forced many Sahrawi from these areas to migrate back to the camps or into Mauritania. And another example of climate combining with conflict to undermine heritage is the shift from traditional tents to concrete dwellings in the camps. And this is the result of people wanting to build more robust dwellings, having more robust homes in the face of the increasing flood risk. So they're moving away from traditional tents, which are incredibly important in Sahrawi culture, to these sort of concrete buildings. And this might not seem that significant, but if we envisage a point at which the Sahrawi did gain their independence, as mandated by a number of UN referenda on self-determination, then they might want to resume something resembling their traditional lifestyle. And so the loss of this heritage would be particularly significant. So these examples illustrate how conflict directly increases vulnerability, while at the same time undermining the culture, heritage, and knowledge that could be used to address vulnerability in, for example, an independent Western Sahara. And this is compounded by an international system that excludes the Sahrawi people and the Sahrawi state, constraining their adaptive capacity and further amplifying their vulnerability, while at the same time providing access to adaptation and mitigation support and resources and finance to the other party in the conflict in this case. So there's a real asymmetry here. So how could this situation be addressed? I think first we need to recognize that Sahrawi culture is a powerful tool for responding to climate change. The traditional pastoralist culture in Western Sahara is based on a deep knowledge of the environment, of the climate, and of natural resources. And this knowledge is actually quite important. It's critical, in fact, for monitoring and responding to climate change and its impacts in the territory. If you don't know what's going on because you're not aware of the resources and of the impacts on the environment, you can't address it. And in fact, notwithstanding some of Cornelius's comments, which are entirely valid, but I think there are two sides here to heritage as a barrier to adaptation, but also as an enabler of adaptation. And we can note here that cultural heritage and traditional knowledge are recognized as climate assets in a recent report from the UN General Assembly. And on top of this, a 2020 report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights explicitly linked human and cultural rights with climate justice. So this provides us with a framework for addressing the situation in Western Sahara that might be extended to other contexts. So I think first we need to think about how we can facilitate support so that these cultural assets can be maintained, not preserved in aspect, but maintained for deployment in a dynamic context. And this might involve unlocking climate finance and enabling non-self-governing territories and peoples such as the Sahrawi to participate more fully in global climate governance. Second, we need to recognize that this and other conflicts act as structural drivers of vulnerability to climate change. And we need to recognize that this vulnerability can be reinforced by the very international systems that are established to ostensibly respond to climate change. So decolonization in Western Sahara is not just an issue of self-determination, it's also an issue of climate justice. And ending the conflict is necessary to comprehensively address vulnerability and climate injustice. And in the meantime, as long as the decolonization process remains stalled, bodies such as the UNFCCC could enable the Sahrawi to participate more fully in global climate governance and finance mechanisms and provide more support for the integration of traditional culture into adaptation in this context. So I think what we see in Western Sahara is an exemplar for other colonized and non-self-governing peoples, and this approach could be applied more widely to ensure they have more of a voice and can access support to address the impacts of climate change that they've done little or nothing to cause. Thanks very much. I hope I didn't overrun too much there.
Thank you, Nick. That was a very, very interesting and inspiring presentation and piece of work. I'm going to just move straight on to our final speaker so we can make sure that we're giving everyone sufficient time to present their work, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time left at the end of this discussion. So our final speaker is Abioye Abiodun Emmanuel from the University of Ibadan. So as well as undertaking graduate research at the University of Ibadan, Abioye is also a high school teacher of history at the Muslim Grammar School in Igboho, Oyo State in Nigeria. Today he's going to present a paper entitled Climate and Igboho History from 1970 to 2021. Welcome, and thank you so much for presenting your paper and sharing your thoughts with us today.
Good day, everyone. My name is Abioye Abiodun Emmanuel. I'm a graduate student and as well a teacher in a high school in Oyo State, Nigeria here. And my topic is on climate and Igbo history. So I would like to share my screen. First is the introduction. Like climate is central to African history, and even though it is not usually reflected as a significant factor that drives the continent's historical occurrences in historical literatures. So West African particularly they've had shared interest, shared historical experience of climate changes from the first big dry of 1600 to 1700. Then we have the little high stage droughts between 1400 and 1570. And currently we're having climatic changes going around the world, and Africa is no exception in its effect. So the West African peoples, including Yoruba people, of which the Igboho people are among, is not exempted from climatic changes, which has restructured and to some extent transformed the people's culture and traditions. So I'm trying to put into perspective how climate is as climatic effect has caused some historical occurrences in Igbo. So first is where is Igbo? Is actually an ancient town, a temporary capital city of Old Oyo Empire between 1500 and 1650, and located at northeastern part of Oyo State, known as Ogyogo. But after the collapse of the empire in the 19th century, the area became to some extent depopulated. But European explorers and other missionaries, European missionaries that passed through the place and visited the town, like they still recorded in their journals infrastructural developments and some other socioeconomic activities that were booming in the town as at then. So, but we have the experience of colonizations and colonial underdevelopment policies that favored in their own new constructed urban areas and neglected the old urban areas. So this caused the depletions and deteriorations of the town from a previously known urban area to a rural area. Then post-colonial governments also sustained the colonial underdevelopment structures and a kind of policy of uneven development. So, and the area is neglected and remain a rural town occupied by mainly agriculturalists till date. So what could have how could have climate affect these people's history? We have in West African history and even Nigerian climatic history, the droughts of 1960 to 1980. And most agriculturalists of northern Nigeria and to some extent some southern part of Nigeria were seriously affected by this climate change. So, and as a result, the herders who were majorly Fulani and they engage in transhumance migrated southward to area like Igbo and the likes. And of course, they were accommodated because there are Fulanis who had lived in Igbo even before 19th century, as far back as 18th century. So they were accommodated, but at some point they began to cause atrocities, looking for pastures and in turn destroying farmers' plantations and other stuffs that resulted in herders farmers crisis. And Igbo was one of those heated areas in herders farmers crisis. The crisis has still continued till date. In fact, has spread all through the entire nations. Is one of these security challenges the country is facing. But how did the people of Igbo, both the migrants, farmers, and the indigenous, combat this cascading effect of climate change? Now, Igbo farmers, they understand the curriculum of climate itself. They understand how it happened. It has happened to them before. So most of the ingenious innovations they adopt to address this issue is by adopting crop rotations or planting crops that could survive drought. Example, cassava. Igboho is known to be a land that favors yam plantations, but they had to survive, like just to survive the drought, and plant cassava and other innovative agricultural practice. So in the case of the marauding herders, so they joint work, they had a joint local security networks that involve the hold, or what they call native Fulani inhabitants who had inhabited the place before long. So to identify and aid the expulsions of the new Fulani herders that were pushed by climatic effects in that area. So, and to a large extent, they were able to at least sustain the intergroup relations that had existed among the migrants. And recently, other states or areas, rural areas, were having issues with like herders and farmers crisis that some even activists has called for secessions, like they want to secede from Nigeria. The initiator of the Yoruba group is from Igboho town here, though he initiated the fact that, okay, because of the crisis caused by Fulani herders killing farmers and kidnapping them, he initiated that they should, Yoruba nations should secede from Nigeria, like the federal government is being partial about. So it's a national issue, but understanding the fact that some rural areas were able to curtail these effects and were able to at least still maintain their intergroup relations, it's is one of the points my presentation is trying to bring out. So in conclusion, like climate change is central to the history of the African peoples, and beyond its effect and reverberating effect is the herders farmers crisis, and it has materialized itself in Igbo history and it has been dealt with. So then currently, like I said, the country is still suffering with Fulani marauders, because many of them have turned marauders due to the fact that they've lost their cattle, and some of them have become kidnappers and killing Nigerians for ransom. So that's my presentation.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it actually followed on very well from Nick's presentation before, with the focus on the value of that really deep, long-standing local knowledge, both in terms of resisting climate change, but also I really enjoyed your emphasis on traditional knowledge on how to maintain positive community relations and intercommunal relations, because I think sometimes that gets a little bit lost in this discussion, and it's incredibly important. So thank you for sharing that with us. I can see we have a total of 6 minutes for discussion, and there has been some quite lively exchanges already in the chat.
Elly,
Aparna,
I just wanted to let you know that we can run over time a little bit, so don't worry if the discussion flows there. We can. No, okay.
I may have to leave because I'm teaching a lecture in 6 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm happy to let you guys run over.
We can continue the discussion, but let's, yeah, okay.
Well, in that case, if I can use my imminent departure as an excuse to ask a question that I found fascinating through this, and I think it links to particularly to Ava's presentation at the start and to Nick's. I wondered, and actually to Cornelius' paradox to us that exchange. I think that there's a really interesting point that's coming out of this, which is the potential opportunities, but also the potential risks in understanding certain elements in conflict and in the post-conflict as heritage. So I'm thinking about Ava's presentation when we're talking about irrigation. Very often, my background is in conflict studies, more peace studies, first and foremost. We often think about something like irrigation as an infrastructure issue. And yet this idea of reframing things as heritage seems to me that there could be an opportunity there, but also risks involved with, well, what happens when you start understanding things as heritage? Does that provoke an us versus them dynamic that could almost be more damaging? So I wondered, I'd love to hear some of our panelists' reflections on what are the risks and opportunities of introducing this way of understanding elements in the conflict and post-conflict as heritage rather than as infrastructure or agriculture, or the ways that they might have traditionally been understood by practitioners working in conflict or in climate change adaptation, for example.
May I? Okay. Thank you a lot for this question. And this is really what every day I'm thinking about this, because before being interested in heritage, I was archaeologist. I'm Syrian. And then I start to work with local community. So I start to feel also how much they are interconnected and how much we can't separate heritage from negotiation. From this, I totally agree from our colleague before who present Palmyra, but in everyday heritage is politicized, and even before the conflict. And we can notice how it was used, why something is important or more important than other aspects. So it's our way to see it as a part of discussion, negotiation between people, and to try to understand local community as a whole, not as a sum of them. As a whole, that means that it can be contrasted. Something cannot be heritage for me, maybe something else for someone else. So how I can manage this and negotiate all this together. It's very important to move to this discussion, and it's not out of heritage. Archaeology maybe is out of heritage, but not heritage, because it's part of our working. If we think about Aleppo now, Aleppo, which is destroyed in the list of UNESCO, they are trying to rehabilitate the market and the old souk of the old city. It's very important, but how I need to understand who remained in Aleppo, who is outside, how they were able to manage to keep this market every time alive. It's not all enough to rehabilitate it and invite people to come back. I need to also understand how will people able to make Aleppo as before. And maybe they can't, maybe Aleppo now has to wait for another, and there is another city will raise now. But we need to think about all these aspects. If not, we are limited to list of nice things, and heritage is not the white bird. It's not like this. Also local community, they are not this nice concept. It's very complex, and we need as experts to be in these details as well. I hope that I answered your question.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I agree that I think sometimes there's a tendency to idealize communities and heritage and all these things as kind of unalloyed positive forces, whereas actually they can be really quite problematic. Cornelius, I saw you had your hand raised as well.
Yeah, just a quick comment, Elly. I thought this was an interesting question you asked. What happens when we call irrigation heritage? And in a way, we all immediately think, heritage, that means there's some sort of legitimate interest to preserve it. But of course, it doesn't have to mean that, because it depends how we define heritage. And we are so stuck in this idea that if it's heritage, it must be rescued and saved and safeguarded, and all these terms that we use. But if we see heritage as something that is continuously changing anyway, that has been something else in the past, is changing now, and will be something else in the future, then really it doesn't make such a big difference if you call it heritage or not. It's just linking it to some cultural issues rather than to some technical ones, maybe. But it's still changing, and still doesn't mean it needs to be the same in the future. I think that is the key, that we open up to define heritage generally in a broader sense. And I know people are thinking about this in terms of living heritage and so on. But in our policy documents, that's not the case. It's all about preserving. There's still so much emphasis on this, and I think that should be taken further.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, in my own work, I'm trying to develop the idea of link up the tradition from peace studies of conflict transformation with the idea of heritage, to try and get this idea of it putting the transformational aspect of it at the center of the way we understand it, the idea that it's always in negotiation and movement, rather than having this kind of idea that's something that stays and must be preserved. Nick, I didn't know if you wanted to come in, if you had any reflections from your side. Oh, you just need to unmute.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I've been concentrating on the comments really in this sort of question of the role of heritage. Is it necessarily a good thing in terms of responding to climate change? And I think just to sort of echo some of the discussion there, I think it depends critically on context and what sort of heritage we're talking about. Yeah, certainly heritage could be a barrier to adaptation, for example, responding to climate change. We can look at, for example, the cultural heritage of the philosophical heritage of a lot of Western societies, and that really is, I think, a barrier to addressing climate change in many respects because of the worldviews it engenders. But then if we look at somewhere like the Sahrawi, then I think there is real potential there for the heritage in terms of the way they manage their environment and interact with it to actually really make a contribution there. I won't ramble on any further. This time is short.
If I may, Elly, I have a question for Nick. May I?
Please, and Aparna, I apologize greatly. I will hand over the rest of the session to you, for unfortunately I have students waiting and they'll be very unhappy with me. But thank you everyone for this absolutely fascinating discussion. It's been really, really wonderful.
Thank you. It would have been lovely to have you on board, but it's okay, we will continue. Thank you. So my question to Nick is this, that Nick, you said something, and please correct me if I'm quoting it out of context, but you said that culture is a powerful tool, and one example that you gave was about tents being very important in Sahrawi culture, and that with the climate change, and you said because of rain, the intense rainfall and all, people are looking to now make more dwellings, construct houses which are so more that protect them from rain. So something that you are basically, and this is again in a way connects with what Cornelius was saying and what Eva was saying and everyone else has been saying. Does that mean you would like those people to remain vulnerable to vagaries of nature and stay in tents because somehow that is their culture and that is important to them? But what about their lives?
Not at all. And I'll say that the only reason I mentioned the tents in the talk was because I ran the presentation past my Sahrawi colleagues and they said, you've got to include the tents. Tents are really critical to our culture. So I'm sort of just channeling my Sahrawi friends and colleagues there. I think that certainly as long as they're in the camps, then tents are not going to be the best form of dwelling, because they do get swept away during the floods. Although often what you find is that families will have a tent and a previously normally a mud brick house, and they'll move to one and the other. So yeah, certainly as long as they're refugees forced to live in high density refugee camps, it's better for them to be in more robust dwellings. I think the point is they don't want to be refugees. They'd rather be in what they see as their homeland, independent and free to, adopt the lifestyles they want. Not everybody would choose to, revert to something resembling nomadic pastoralism. A lot of them would want to live in urban centers, and they wouldn't want to live in tents. But this is something that the Sahrawi people I've spoken to, I spent about a decade, traveling to the liberated territories and through the camps. So these are things that are important to them. They're saying, because of our situation, because we're refugees, we are losing our, elements of our culture. We're losing this knowledge. And, if we do get our homeland back, then, we've lost that heritage. And I think they're making efforts to, try and sustain that. And certainly there's a whole, issue of sort of nation building that's gone on as a result of the conflict. So their heritage and their culture is evolving and adapting, responding to their situation. Certainly not for me as an outside Western sort of academic researcher to sort of make any judgment on what they should be doing. But this is one of the things that is absolutely critical as a nomadic population, the tents and the sort of congregations of tents, it's something that's sort of iconic for them. And so that's where that's coming from.
So, but then this is exactly, it brings me back to the question which I would like us to, as a group, to like dig deeper into. And this is what I think Cornelius was also saying, and yesterday Laura Jane Smith in her keynote said, heritage is a process, is a practice, is a performance. And it's also like, what people link with, what it evokes, when you, so if tent is something that is, so maybe we have to focus more on what happens in a tent, what is the process which is expressed, through, so we are focusing on the outer part, but not the, the inner core of that practice and that which is around the tent, right? So and if I don't know if you were with us, and this is I'm throwing now at everyone. So and also like I think Abiodun said that the relations between communities. So if we are looking at conflict, so then the UN Special Rapporteur, who gave a keynote address on the inaugural day, said that. We would, during the Q&A, she said that we need alternative development models that are, perhaps the development model that we have now is not suitable. So I am looking at, I was thinking as you people all were talking, you are all talking the same thing, but there needs to be some sort of a plug-in, like all this cultural knowledge or the cultural practices, whether you want to call it heritage, or it's not so important that we get lost in terminology, but what is it that we are talking about that should be used for alternative development models, which are people-based and not so much state-oriented. So are we looking at that? Are we thinking about that as a possible solution between culture, conflict, and drivers of conflict and peace? Is that what we want to take away from this discussion? I see Joanne's hand going up.
Yes, hello. I haven't, although I've been in the chat, I haven't had a chance to speak. I want to first just say thank you to Eva. I'm also a Near Eastern archaeologist and spent much time in Syria, worked in Hama and Homs, and spend a lot of time in Homs. And so it's nice to meet you and hear your talk, and I completely support your view, absolutely. I think as heritage as a concept has become more complex in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, the term is a Western construct and it comes out of archaeology. And with that, because it's a Western construct arising from archaeology, it was in the past quite simplified, because it dealt with usually built heritage or tangible remains, which didn't change. So of course, or we wanted to conserve in aspect and stop changing. We have now widened this up quite rightly, because we are thinking about heritage in a global context, and also much more sort of multivalent to reflect all of the people in the world who think about heritage or their practices and their traditions in ways that are far different from us, me in the West. And by doing that, and rightly doing that, we've complicated the idea. So Cornelius's points that he makes are very, they're completely valid. But it's within this context of a much wider discourse, I think, about, and we're only, I think, just beginning to unpack this about how we're going to address these issues around the multivalency of heritage in the future. And I think that's what we're grappling with here.
Thank you, Joanne, for that insight. I think that's very valuable. But I would like to also bring in Abiodun for, what do you think in context of Nigeria, what we are discussing? How is this awareness even that there is a cultural connection to the conflict and between the conflict and environmental stresses? How does this awareness how it will help in perhaps looking for building lasting peace?
Exactly. I think first of all, I would say while I stumbled on this conference was because I was working on a particular paper about Holtorf Empire and its heritage. Like Holtorf Empire has shifted its capital, is now a state, is now used as a state. The empire does not exist, but there are some relics of that empire that archaeologists have actually studied, and they've come up with a very tangible history about the empire, how vast it was, and how it upholds the culture, the Yoruba culture. You must have heard about, I don't know if you have heard about the Yoruba people. So they are one of the most important and one of the populated people that populated southern Nigeria. So the issue with the issue with culture and conflicts, like, is I was saying, I said in my work that okay, some activists have come up to the fact that okay, since farmers crisis is causing a kind of a disruptions between the Fulani and the Yoruba people and even other tribes. They believe that these Fulani herders that were pushed by climate change effect of drought down to southern areas, they are not going to only destroy their farms, but in the long run claim to own the land if possibly they were given opportunity to settle in that particular area. So some Yoruba activists were actually clamoring for a kind of secession, that the Yoruba people should secede from Nigeria. So in that case, it's more or less like splitting Nigeria as a whole. But the essence of why I come to like what I want to link with your question and the point of discussion is the fact that UNESCO itself that deals with World Heritage they've only identified maybe some like 3 or 4 heritage or cultural sites in Nigeria, and I think about less than 9% of its preserved heritages, world heritages, and culture. Africa has just like less than 9%. So there is this kind of imbalance in the aspect of saying, okay, this is world heritage. Although empire has remained on the tentative list for maybe since 1991 or so, they've not reviewed it. It has not been included. The relics and the likes, they are depleting. In fact, the marauders, they use that area as a kidnappers den. So imagine that kind of problems. If the United Nations can come in, maybe possibly there is a kind of a program that would, apart from the fact that they are going to add it to the World Heritage List, make programs and policy that will preserve those areas. And once it's preserved, the people will understand the fact that, okay, their culture, their traditions, their heritage are being preserved. And not only United Nations anyway, the Nigerian government has also neglected these people. Many people in the rural areas were neglected. The policy on culture and tourism, the tourism industry is in total collapse entirely. I don't know if in other parts West Africa, but Nigeria, as a case study, it's a total is in total collapse. So we don't see people coming around to visit some places, because even those sites, they're not in good conditions. Many of them, the only thing it left is you only let the little relics that archaeology can dig up from the past. I can give you an example. There is about 8 kilometers wall that was built around the empire, the capital city of the empire, very closer to the Niger River. Niger River is what you call Niger River in Nigeria. Yeah. So that's particular place, the wall, as I think it has reduced from that 8 kilometers to some maybe centimeters. It has almost depleted. We have people that work, archaeologists that are working on Yoruba history. They go to those areas. They also called for this kind of supports that, okay, they should recognize these areas. The people themselves, in fact, the people have moved from that area because considering Nigerian history, it's passed through colonization and the likes. So there's no more Yoruba people over there. So the Fulani, the Hausa Fulani has dominated the northern part, because Oyo Empire was almost located in the northern part of Nigeria before now. So it's a very complicated issues, and I think if United Nations in conjunction with other African countries and countries can come together and restructure not only the definitions, but just even the site itself. Those sites that are important to the people themselves, not just because I studied that North American and Europe had about 47 or close to 48% of the cultural sites and natural sites on the World Heritage List. So it's kind of an imbalance. And if they can come in and at least not only educate people, but work towards preserving and conserving those areas, it will help in a very long way to preserve the people's culture. And we now have climate change as well in progress. So it's like compilations of so many issues on depletions of culture and our heritage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those valuable, comments. And I think all of us. I would not like to, try to sum up too much, because that would reduce from what you have actually tried to say. But definitely it points to that we need to go beyond dominant discourses of what we are understanding of current understanding of what is heritage, but also to look at it in relation to people and their life ways, and going deeper into, going for more local discourses, localized understanding of nuances. If I'm saying it correctly, please jump in. I don't want to be, I just want to facilitate the discussion here. And I would like to bring Tianyue to this discussion again. Tianyue, you presented a beginning of a research which is very systematic. You have variables. If you're still with us, if you can switch on your camera and unmute yourself. My question to you is that after listening to this discussion, do you think you would like to, you have some ideas on how you could bring the cultural dimensions in your current research?
Yes, previously I want to include how climate change and conflict will affect the cultural heritage. But after the discussion, I thought maybe how we understand cultural heritage and how we handle and preserve them will also in fact affect how we mitigate the impacts of climate change. So I want to develop investigate more in the practices of how we treat cultural heritage and how they can affect our mitigation and adaptation to climate change.
Okay. So now, I don't want to take up too much of time. We are running out of time, but I have one question for our all the panelists of today. And I see there are also comments coming from people. If you feel like asking a question, please just unmute yourself and ask a question at this point. But my last question for all the panelists is call to action. So what's your call to action? Like Cornelius, starting from you, what should happen in policy, research? You choose policy, research, or practice. What should happen to change what you're trying to say? Like what you're trying to say, the essence of it, and what should happen? What should change for you?
That's a good question. And I think I agree also, Aparna, with what you said earlier, that really the point about putting people first has long been on our agenda, but it's ever more current and important, still not fully implemented. So that is the starting point. But in order to do this, I think, and that's my suggestion, we also need to rethink what we mean by heritage. And by that, I mean not just politicians but ourselves. Because everything what has been said in this session, I mean, this is all valid, and I'm sort of trying to polarize a little bit here for the sake of discussion. So I'm not. I think you got that. But the point is that it's not in the people's interest if we put them into boxes all the time. Sometimes, of course, it is beneficial, but in many cases it's not. So we need to define heritage in a different way. It's not always something that is positive. It doesn't always need to be preserved. It's not always permanent and eternal and timeless and so on, but it's much more dynamic, which I know we've long understood in specific case studies, but it's still not part of the way we define these terms. I think that's our task. And once we've done that, then we are ready to address the next round of Sustainable Development Goals and the Antonio Guterres agenda. But we need to be ready for that. We can't always say, oh, but you need to preserve the heritage. That's why they ignore us. That's my interpretation, because it doesn't matter to them. We need
so
to.
How are you going to bring it into wider policy, or your call to action? Like what call to action?
Well, rethink our terms, educate people in different ways. It's about what people do, what they think, what effects it has in society, how we relate to each other, all of these things. It's not about monuments.
Okay, thank you. So it's not about monuments, and we need to think about it differently. And you're going to do it through your critical heritage program on heritage futures, right?
Well, we do our bit and try to have these sort of discussions as often as possible.
Thank you. And moving on to Abiodun, and then I will come to Nick and Joanne, and then Tianyue, and then also Eva. Okay. So Abiodun, what is your call to action? What would you like to see change, or in policy, practice, research? What would you like to change? And how would you take it forward? We lost him for a while. I'll start with Eva. Eva, go ahead.
Thank you. I will build on what's said by Cornelius, that my point of view, we need to move away from the toolkit and already theories and prepared terms. We need really to move away and look to the knowledge that comes from our practices. So we need to reconsider our definition based on our context also. I'm talking from a colonized country. So we have different history. We have different kind of clientelism or different issues. So we need to see in this context, after all this history, how people understand heritage and what is heritage in this area. We need to be really to move away from the things that sometimes they became obstacle, and we put it like in one sentence. We use community, local community, heritage-based, resilience, very nice. It's something more complex than this. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's really rich. Tianyue, what would you like to do or change?
Maybe because I use a large scale analysis, so I think sometimes we also need to do some case studies to show the many facts about some narratives and our understanding about the cultural heritage. I think we need to explore on the methods that we want to understand these relationships.
Okay, thank you. So that's great. And now to Nick and Joanne, and then I will come back to Abiodun. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. So with some of the people who are here in this session, I was involved in a meeting in December that was hosted by ICOMOS, UNESCO and IPCC, and a lot of very, very good ideas and statements came out of that. I think one that really struck me was that there needs a greater intersection of language, not just across, but principally, I think, across policy sectors, so that if we want to integrate heritage into policy, like the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, I think there needs to be an understanding within language how we speak to each other. And a lot of the people at that meeting seemed to think that that was quite an important area of intersection.
Okay, that's, I think, yeah, I agree. It's a great suggestion and should be done to have a language which is understood by all actors and stakeholders across board. Yeah. And Nick, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think but drawing on what I was discussing in context of Western Sahara, what I'd like to see is a greater voice and greater participation, not just of indigenous peoples, but also non-self-governing peoples and territories in these sort of formal climate governance processes. For example, the Sahrawi Republic, although it's a member of the African Union, has been recognized over the years by about 80 countries, has no voice in climate negotiations. So we're working we will be working on trying to sort of get them least observer status at the UNFCCC. But I think there are peoples across the globe who are colonized peoples, indigenous peoples, non-self-governing peoples who are excluded from these mechanisms. And what we end up with in, for example, the UN agencies is a particular sort of type of discourse that excludes them and actually can end up being complicit in their vulnerability and in sort of colonization and occupations we see in Western Sahara. So I think we need to really look at how we can address that situation and widen this out so that people whose voices are excluded now have a greater voice and can actually have more of a say in how they and others approach the issues around their own culture and climate change. And it's not just white academics like me who are talking on their behalf. So these sorts of forums.
No, that you make a very important point, and it's well taken. Abiodun, would you like to add to that, or add a point of departure or something for us?
Yeah, I should also add to it, like the people themselves should find means, like they should. There are so many inventions. That's why I said when the drought issue was happening to the people of Igboho, they adopted some kind of agricultural practice, innovative agricultural practice that actually saved them from that particular drought. So in the case of climate change or possibly depletions of heritage, maybe their language and things like that, there could be an adoption. The people themselves can come up with ingenious, innovative, how will I put it, practices that could help in the preservations of their culture. It's just all about the fact that when the United Nations and international organizations are discussing these issues and way forwards, they don't bring the people into play. Like they have the, how will I put it, possibly the stands like the know-it-all of the nation. So the people themselves knows some things that they can do, like they have their own traditional knowledge that can be adopted and be helpful. So that's my contribution.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. We have also many comments in the chat box, and I thank all the contributors of this panel. In summary, I think if you all agree with me, we can say that the root causes of conflicts and the prolonged vulnerabilities that exist are also interrelated with our notion of our idea of heritage and culture. And in fact, some of them are contributed through culture and heritage, and all the practices that we have around heritage, which exclude people from certain frameworks, as has been said, international frameworks, and we need to give more agency to people. And is that our takeaway from this panel? Do you agree, all the speakers? Have I summed it up well, or would you like to add one last word to this?
No, I think you've summed it up really well. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time and for these very interesting papers, and also to all the contributors who have given us very interesting comments, and also some links have been shared. We will compile all these discussions and try to bring them out in some way and share them with the larger from people who are watching us from different platforms, from Facebook, from the Attendee Hub, and from this Zoom link. Thank you so much for your attention. And do we have the next session in here? The link for the next session. Marcy, would you like to say something?
No, I was just signing on to wave and say thank you.
Okay.
Aparna, sorry, the link to the next session is in the chat.
Okay, the link to the next session is in the chat. Yes, I can see it's a panel on building a map of climate impacts on culture and heritage. And some of the discussions that we've had, or some of the threads, will be taken up further in that panel. And those of you who would like to join us for that, the link is there in the chat. Thank you so much for your attention.